So thank you all for joining us today. I'm really excited to have this conversation. Randy and his team at Level 12 have been amazing partners for us here at Woven. And something that through the content webinars we've done in the past, I've gotten a lot of questions from engineering leaders about Agile implementation. And candidly, I'm not very smart about it. So I wanted to bring somebody on who's a lot smarter than I am and has a lot more experience running Agile teams than I do. And Randy is, I think he's got a lot of great insights to share with everybody here. So I am really excited to hear from you, Randy, and I'm going to spend most of my time being quiet and listening and learning from you. But I want to kick it over to you so you can give a little bit of background about who you are and what you do at Level 12 and what's made your team so effective at running an Agile shop.
Yeah, so I'm Randy Syring. I am, as the slide says, the Chief Executive Developer at Level 12. We are a custom software and data development shop. We serve customers who need custom software or custom data solutions, and they come to us with a variety of problems, everything from helping autonomous drone systems or helping to do autonomous inspections with drones to building backends for business processes like you'd find at just about every business. So we have a pretty broad spectrum of things we do from a technical perspective. And from a agile and software development perspective, I am not your typical business leader. I don't think. I really didn't ever want to be in business, really. I just wanted to build good software. And as I had more and more clients ask for additional work, I brought on more team. It just kind of developed over time that I realized there were certain things that I was doing to make us successful in software development where I felt like as I was out in the community and even talking with customers who had bad experiences previously, I was recognizing a pattern of how we were doing things. And so I started thinking, I wonder, there must be somebody else out there who's seen these same patterns. And lo and behold, Agile, was out there. This is probably, I don't know, 10 years now when I started to realize, wow, there's this Agile thing and they're talking about the exact same things that I'm feeling internally. So I wasn't exposed to Agile and then kind of set out to implement it. It was more like I was already doing it because I felt like this was just the way to do good software development. And then I got exposed to Agile and realized, oh, wow, there's people who have actually thought about this and have, more experiences than I do. And they were able to articulate the things that I was seeing and feeling much better than I was able to. And so we just continued to build on those principles that worked for us in software development, in delivering things to customers, and then just continued to learn and grow and change our processes as we realized that we needed to change them, which I think is one of the things I'm going to try to focus on here today in terms of a more agile. We really want to talk about if you're doing Agile well, your Agile should probably be changing over time and not very rigid. So we'll get into that later. Hopefully that is a good introduction. Did I leave anything out?
I think you nailed it. And it's crazy to think that maybe if we're actually going to be agile, we should be changing and adapting over the course of time. Seems really intuitive, but it's really hard in practice. So
it is really hard in practice.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and dive in. I know that you've got a lot of thoughts on this subject.
Yeah. So just a little agenda here. I've got hopefully maybe about 20 minutes of slides, and then we're going to try to save about 10 minutes, I think, for questions. I'm not sure how you want to run the question and answer, Tim. I like a more interactive, experience. So if people have questions in the meantime, I think they should feel free to throw those up. And if you see good ones and want me to answer them, I guess you can get that over to me. But let me start out by making a really important distinction here that's going to help us understand what Agile is and how an Agile works. And that is principles versus implementations. So one of the things that I realized as a business owner is that my team would function more effectively if they understood the reason why I do things as opposed to just how to do them. And so let me give you an example. We have a checklist application that we use at Level 12 to help us with various things like onboarding. When we onboard a new employee, there's a lot of stuff that we want to accomplish with them. There's a lot of accounts that need to get set up, and trying to do that ad hoc is very error prone. And so I went out, I looked at a bunch of different checklist apps, and I ultimately picked one, and I told the team to use it. Over time, I got some flack back from some team members because they didn't like the app, it didn't do this or didn't do that. And you know, that it wasn't that they were incorrect. It's just that I had a reason why I picked that app that I realized I hadn't shared with anybody. And so the reason for picking that checklist app was because as I read about how to do checklists and how they are successful or unsuccessful in organizations, one of the key principles that I picked up on was that checklists will usually fail in an organization when they're not easily updated to match current practices. And so when I was looking through checklist apps, the one thing that I was really focusing on and optimizing for was how easy is it to edit a checklist if it needs to be modified. And the tool that I picked, while it had some rough edges, it did that one thing really well. And because of that, I wanted to use that app because I felt at a fundamental guiding principle level that was going to be more successful for level 12 than another tool that might be a bit more shiny but missed that core principle. It didn't have it. And so one of the things that I needed to do with my team was explain the principle to them, why we were using that, which was more helpful for them to understand why we kind of used the tool that had the rough edges. But also, if they wanted to go look for different tools like that, they would be able to not miss that guiding principle and say, oh, this one's shiny, but yeah, it doesn't have that ease of ability to edit the checklist, which is a core important feature for it to function well in the organization. So all of that to say, when I could explain the principle, they still may not like the tool, but they understand why it's essential that we use that tool. And if they want to change the tool, they've got to satisfy that core guiding principle before they pick a different tool. And so the principle ends up being more important than the implementation. Does that seem pretty clear to you so far?
That seems clear to me. Absolutely. I'm excited to dive deeper into that. I'm thinking through if I have questions on that, because I know that is a focusing from a management side on the principles behind something is so important, so crucial. I'm glad you pulled out that distinction.
Yeah. Okay. So the reason I pulled it out is because this is essential to understanding Agile, what Agile is, and how an Agile team remains Agile itself. So one of the real difficulties with Agile currently is there's a bit of semantic diffusion going on. And semantic diffusion is kind of a fancy phrase, but it describes when a word that is used by a person or group has a really good definition, but then it gets spread throughout a wider community in a way that weakens that definition. So as the definition is weakened, you begin to lose the actual real substance of what that term meant originally, and the term in itself kind of becomes useless. We see a similar principle in some products like Kleenex, where originally Kleenex was not what we called tissue paper. It was a certain brand of tissue paper, but it's become used so frequently that it's synonymous with it. It's kind of the same, except that in Agile, instead of it still being tissue paper, it's kind of been watered down to what Agile originally meant. So I think it's really important first to talk about what Agile is not. And this brings us back a little bit to principles versus implementations. Agile is not an implementation. It is not a methodology. It is not a framework or a process. It is not a specific way of developing software. It's really important to understand that the implementations that we see out there, whether they be Scrum or Kanban or XP, which is extreme programming, or SAFe, which is a more of an enterprise Agile, all of these things these are implementations. These are ways of potentially doing Agile, but they're not Agile in and of itself. And so, for example, you could have somebody practicing Scrum, and Scrum, a peer form of Scrum is likely going to be Agile, but you could have people practicing Scrum in a way that was not Agile. Additionally, Agile is not Scrum. So while the best Scrum will be Agile, Agile is not Scrum. It's also not Kanban. It's a set of values and principles. So Agile is a set of values and principles that were defined in what's called the Agile Manifesto. And you can Google that. I didn't want to put it on the slide because I didn't want to get too much into all of the specifics of the values and principles of the Agile Manifesto. But you can bring it up, and there are ultimately 4 principles. There are 4 values and 12 principles that define an Agile belief system. So Agile is a belief system, not the practices or the implementations that have flowed out from that belief system. The reason that this is kind of hard and the reason that the semantic diffusion has occurred is because practices are visible and values often aren't. And so it's very common for us to look out to people or to other organizations or potentially to other teams in our organizations and look at what they're doing and then copy what they're doing. But if it's not clear that there's a set of values and principles behind what they're doing, we could very much, we could end up being in a situation where we have copied the practices, but they don't have the heart. We're missing the heart of why they worked for that team. And our team might be different enough that those same practices don't give us the same benefit. So that brings well, I guess before that brings us to questions, comments, concerns about any of that.
I love that. That's so valuable, and I think that's something I've recognized in every aspect of my life. Right? It doesn't matter. The motion that you're going through is not important. It is why you are doing the motion and the desired outcome of the motion. I love that distinction. So I'm excited to dive deeper.
Yeah. Okay. So the why is really important, as you said, and this gets us to, again, not delving into so much what is Agile, but trying to focus on how do you do a more agile? How do you make sure that the agile things that you're doing don't become rigid? So pulling one value and one principle out of the Agile Manifesto here, value number 4 in the Agile Manifesto is we value responding to change over following a plan. And principle number 12 is at regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective, then tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly. So built into the Agile values and principles is this sense of reflection and adjustment. And so we want to have that sense of reflection and adjustment, not just about the software we're building, but also about the Agile practices that we've decided to implement that have flowed out of our values. And so let's talk a little bit about what this might look like. So if we move to the next slide, we should, as an Agile team, be revisiting and revising our own practices. So for example, it should be perfectly legitimate for a team that starts as a Scrum team to begin to recognize that maybe Scrum doesn't fit that team or their organization very well. And they begin to learn about Kanban, and they realize, Kanban actually works better for us. So this is actually at level 12, as I became familiar with Agile. Most of the Agile community is often talks about Scrum. You will hear Scrummy things in the videos and in the conversations and in the conferences. You'll hear a lot of people talking about Scrum, and there's a lot of things that have been adopted from Scrum even without using Scrum. Things like having a daily stand-up. So I was one of those people that really wanted to be a purist. So I was looking for an implementation that I could just adopt fully. But what I realized as I began to look at implementations was that while there were some things I liked about Scrum, being a software consultant where I want to be very responsible to my client's needs meant that I couldn't be really, really strict about a sprint. I might want to be strict about a sprint, but if I have a client who says, hey, look, I've got this really important thing, it's coming up in 3 days, I'd like you to break this sprint and focus focus on that instead. I want to make them aware of the cost of doing that, but I don't want to say no. So that's where I'm at as a business. So I adopted Kanban, a Kanban methodology, as opposed to Scrum because it fit my particular needs better. But as we grew, if we had a tendency to move more towards a product focus, I should be willing as a business owner and leader to consider going back to Scrum, because at that point it may serve us better than Kanban. You should also feel free, for example, if you have daily stand-ups, maybe you realize the daily stand-ups just aren't working. They're not actually helping. Nobody's benefiting from them. Well, maybe you move to doing daily Slack reports on what you're planning to do that day, what you did the past day, what you're planning to do on today, and then you're going to have a weekly hour-long meeting instead. Those are the kinds of changes that we're thinking about. Or it could be something like story points. Maybe we start with story points because that's what everybody says we should do, but we realize that it would actually be more helpful for our team to do estimates in hours, and we're not so concerned about our management like really holding our feet to the fire. We want to be able to plan in terms of days and weeks worth of work, and that seems more useful to us as an organization. So we should feel free as Agile teams to revisit and revise those practices to make sure that they're still in line with Agile values, but they give us the flexibility to change as our organizational needs and understanding of our needs change. So let me see, where am I going with that? Principles and values in place first. Yeah. So as we look to change our practices, there's always a fear there, and I think there's probably especially a fear in terms of management, like, Agile is supposed to be working. We're going to change the practices. Oh my gosh, what if we break this and make it worse? So I think it's really important that the first thing the team has to ask is, do we really have the Agile values and principles at the core of what we're doing? Is that really in our culture, or are we just kind of practicing the practices kind of soullessly or heartlessly? And if the answer is yes, we're just doing the practices and we're a bit soulless, then we just need to focus a little bit more on understanding, well, why are we doing these practices? What are the Agile principles and values that got us to this point? Let's go back to the principles and values and then reevaluate kind of where we are in the organization and in the change process. And then we also at that point, if we're really confident that we've adopted the principles and values, we should be willing to get rid of practices. So I think there's always that fear when you kind of get rid of stuff, but we should be willing to discard practices that no longer serve the principles and values, the Agile principles and values that we've believed in.
Wow, that really hits me hard. I in a previous life, I managed a team, and we tried to use an Agile framework. We tried to use a Kanban style framework with our management practices, and I had to break the structure several times for tight deadlines or things that needed to be turned around that didn't really fit our methodology. And the feedback I got from my team is, Tim, this feels really whiplashy. I feel like we're changing management structure and how the processes we're using to deliver things frequently. And that was unsettling to a lot of people. It felt like we were whiplashing back and forth between practices. And I think what I'm realizing as I'm hearing you talk is I didn't do a good enough job as a leader of instilling the values. We were going through the practices, but when we had to change the practices, there was no underlying bedrock that was firm. If you instill those values in place and those are firm, then the tectonic plates on top of it can shift, and it's not going to be as jarring for the team. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yeah, I think that's right. Now, it could have been actually that you really were, from a priorities perspective, you really were going back and forth a lot. And so, I would almost have to be there to know, was the problem the shifting the priorities, or was the problem that we felt like the commitment to the process was broken? In which case, what you really may have needed to do is just rethink the process, right? Like, for example, if we've committed to do, I did some CTO consulting for a client. Level 12, we practice 2-week sprints. But what I realized when I came into that organization is, they really they weren't always really clear about what they wanted to work on next. But the developers were getting a lot of like executive whiplash. Like there was a lot of, oh, we're supposed to be working on this, and oh wait, now we're supposed to be working on that. And so there was a hesitancy, like okay, let's go 2 months or let's go 2 weeks in the sprint. And there's like, oh my gosh, I don't know that we can go 2 weeks. And I said, okay, fine, let's go 1 week. You guys need to agree to let your developers focus for a week on what you said was important at the beginning of the sprint. And you can't break that. Again, this was more of a product shop, so this was okay. You've got to get in the habit of having delayed gratification on what you want to do. At the same time, I recognize that you do have shifting priorities and you do learn new things on a relatively quick basis because you're more of a startup. So let's narrow that window down a little bit so that we're giving you the opportunity to reevaluate priorities once a week instead of once every 2 weeks. And that ended up being a really good fit for their organization, where at level 12, I don't think I'd want to go that direction. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's an example of where, we were able to tweak what I did in my process as I applied it to a different organization with different needs.
Yeah, I love that. So I'm excited about this next bullet point. How do you know if a team is agile?
Yeah, so I think, really, if a team is agile, if they know and understand the principles and the values laid out in the Agile Manifesto. And they're making the decisions about how they structure their process of delivery, whether that's software or something else, based on those same Agile values and principles. So when they sit down and they ask the question, hey, look, we feel like we're getting tossed around a lot in terms of priorities, as you begin to solve the process and put things in place to solve that sense of being tossed about, what is grounding the decisions you make? What is grounding what you do there? Is it everybody's feeling of what would work best, or are you going back to the Agile principles and values as written in the Agile Manifesto and saying, okay, how do these principles and values apply? How do they inform the decisions we're going to make here as we're considering how to deliver this software or whatever? So that's how you know. And how can you recognize faux agile is the exact opposite. You recognize, okay, the processes might be in place. They might be doing stand-ups. They might be doing, they might have a Scrum Master, but I'm not seeing any real commitment to agile values or principles as they go about their daily tasks, or as they go about the decision-making about how to run the software development teams, or even from higher in the organization about how to think about how, the software gets written in terms of priorities and what's matching the business. So it all comes down to, can you even articulate the values and principles in the Agile Manifesto? Again, there's only 4 values, 12 principles. Can you name even 4 or 5 of them? If not, if your team is not even familiar with those things, then I think it's hard for them to say, yeah, we're really agile, because they don't really know what agile is. They might know what some people have said agile is, but they don't really know what the agile principles and values are, and maybe have not given enough thought to why those principles and values work. But if they did get more familiar with them, and they did begin to learn and understand why those values and principles were chosen, then they'd be more able to apply those values and principles to the particulars of their setting.
I love that. We're ready for questions, aren't we?
Yep, ready for questions. If anybody has any.
So if anyone has questions, drop them in the Q&A section or in the chat section. We're actively monitoring that. One of the questions that popped up for me, and I'm going to call out the irony in me saying this based on the context of this conversation, because we've talked about how Agile is not a set of practices, it's the underlying values. But one of the things that stood out to me is when we talk about reviewing at a regular interval to determine whether or not this is serving our needs. One of the things that I think I've fallen down on when I've led Agile teams in the past is that is an easy thing to fall off the priority list if I don't define what is that regular interval. Are we looking at this once a quarter, once a month, once a week? When do we bake that into the process? And I'd love to hear when you have seen teams be really successful, obviously knowing that, this is no practice is going to be one size fits all or a great
Yep.
solution for everyone. But I'd love to hear what you've seen be successful as to when we should be reassessing that.
Yeah. So one of the big things that I felt in my organization, and again, it's, it's relatively small. I think we've got about 16 people right now. So, this is all small business context, but I recognized two things. One, I needed to give people a place to put things when they had questions like that wouldn't interrupt current work, but where they also felt like it would actually get addressed, so that they didn't feel like they were wasting their time to write it down. And so in most of the functional areas in my business, whether it's business development or leadership or development team or administrative, we use Confluence, an Atlassian product for documentation. Almost every functional area has a page called discussion topics. And if you want to bring something up in terms of discussion, you can write that down, and then each functional area has regularly scheduled meetings depending upon the value of those meetings to the people in the functional area. So biz dev admin, we both operate in 2-week intervals. So we'll review those discussion lists every couple of weeks. My dev team has monthly meetings. So the developers, we're not changing things as frequently. Developers in general, you want to be productive and you don't want to be interrupting them with needless meetings. So we only do those once a month. And then my leadership team, we've just really started that team, but we're going to be meeting once every 6 weeks in Zoom. And then I have one of my core leadership team who's in North Dakota. And so he's actually going to fly in once a quarter so that we can do face-to-face meetings once a quarter, as a leadership team. So to me, it's both. The team has to know there's going to be a meet, like we are actually going to get to this stuff. And then you have to have a place to write it down where everybody can see it and know that issue has come up. That way, that gives them a little bit of time to think about it. You wouldn't have to use a Confluence page. It could be a GitHub issue, that you put on. The key is that you're scheduling the meetings and you're having those at regular intervals, again, so that the team that's writing those things down can have confidence that the things they're seeing or they want to bring up are addressed. And then obviously at like the leadership level, we can have more structural things built into those meetings. So we might have an agenda where, at every one of my leadership meetings, one of the questions might be, how are we doing with our development processes? Do we need to tweak any of that? So that could fall into kind of the retrospective of, does our do we need to revisit some of how we're doing Agile to be more agile?
I absolutely love that story, especially because it really hits home to me the importance of making sure that cadence is specific to the group based on what's going to be relevant for that group. That's a perfect anecdote to illustrate what I've struggled with. Max had a really good question. He said he's been using Agile loosely since about 2006 without being certified. He wants to know how important you think it is to become certified, or how he could put that on his resume, get some value out of that.
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is, I think it really depends on the position that you're trying to be hired for. So I don't know if Max wants to tell us, what kind of job, if he's a developer or a project manager or, something like that. But, from my perspective, I don't think to do Agile, you need a certification. In fact, I had one guy tell me one time, he was leading growth for a startup. And, he was interviewing to do some work for us. And he told me, over the course of, I don't know, a year last year, I got every one of my team members certified as a Scrum Master. And I'm thinking, I didn't say this to him because I was trying to be nice, but I was like, that's stupid. Now, if what you really meant was I got everybody training on what Agile is, that's fine. But you don't need everybody to be certified. Not everybody's going to be a Scrum Master. So why would you certify everybody as a Scrum Master? I don't know. That just didn't make sense to me. Maybe stupid's too much, too strong of a pejorative. But so as a product manager or somebody who wants to be in part of managing development teams, I could see where some people in the industry, especially if they were more on the corporate side, are going to care about a certification. If you stay more on the startup-y, scrappy side, I think people are going to be a lot more interested in if you actually know what Agile is and how you practice it. But to be real honest with you, I've talked to so many people and I've heard so many stories about people who say we're doing Agile, and then you get in there and it's not Agile at all. So yes, potentially, but then again, I don't know that I'd spend a whole lot of time on it. I'd probably want to talk to some recruiters first, maybe, to see, what they're seeing in the industry and whether or not the certification matters.
That's really interesting. When I think when we think about how few people are actually living through those principles of Agile, I wonder if there's value to, even if you don't get certified, going through and making sure that you're specifically calling out in your resume or in interview questions, examples of times that you've lived out those principles. Because to me, I feel like even without a certification, showing that that's sort of a shibboleth in a way, being able to articulate the fact that you understand and live those principles in a way that a lot of people overlook.
Yeah, that's, at least to me as an employer, I'm much more interested in people who can articulate Agile principles as opposed to being able to put a certification down.
Awesome. Clint had an awesome question in the chat. He said, Agile allows you to respond and adjust quickly to changing needs, which can mean redirecting resources to develop new features that were previously not considered. He wants to know, as a leader, how do you push back? We can build X new feature, but Y, we need to be willing to not have so much of Y. Like, how do you push back on that to find that right balance so that the needs aren't constantly shifting?
Yeah, so I think this has a lot to do with the type of dynamic there is between the people who run the business side of the business and those who are actually managing the software delivery and development process. If there's a really good and trusting relationship there, it's actually really smooth, because the people above should be saying something like, hey, I'm thinking about doing X. What kind of impact would this have on us as an organization? What other priorities have we articulated that would that limit or hinder, so that I can make a business level decision about kind of which direction I want to use our resources. So I do think that decision is often something that needs to be made higher, but the reason I think a lot of business decision makers have a hard time with that is because their visibility into those dynamics is very limited. And so one of the things that's really effective is to use a backlog. So you can use software where you can actually have a backlog. And what we found is, even with our clients, most of them don't want to be in the issues. Like, the issues is too granular for them. So what we do is we actually often keep like priority documents that at a high level list the business level priorities that have already previously been communicated to us. And so what we'll say is we'll have that document up when we're meeting with our clients, usually every 2 weeks at the end of a sprint or towards the end of a sprint. We'll be saying, hey, look, this is what we got done. Here's what we're going to plan to do. And they might say, okay, I know we were planning to do X, but I've got this other thing. This is what I think I'd like to do. What do you guys think about where this goes? And we can say, okay, this is kind of, so right now, I think this is the rough effort that would be, that it would take to do this. How big of a deal is this really to the business? And then we would begin to negotiate. So where we put them is, okay, roughly, here's what I think this is going to take. Where would you put this in the list of the priorities that you've already given me? So I might have 10 on the page already. Where does this fit? And as they're looking at the page, they might actually go, oh, wow, that's like a 7. And then you could be like, well, look, we're not even going to get to that level for probably like 3 months. So, can we is it okay to table this discussion? And they might go, yeah, I guess we should table it because all the other things on that list are more important. Well, then you got other times where they go, no, that needs to be like number 1 or number 2. Like, this is really something that it's at the top of the list and it pushes everything else down. Okay, great. That's actually what I want to hear. So part of Agile, even the point that we said earlier, the point number 12 was, where is it? I'm finding it in my notes. At regular responding, we value responding to change over following a plan. So in that case, it may very well be that Agile is doing for us what we want to do, and that is, we're able to respond to the changing needs of the business and reallocate developer resources towards what the business says is important. So I'm reading Clint's question here. Backlogs tend to be full of future features, tasks to manage technical debt, and tasks for addressing bug fixes. Given that, how does innovation work itself in an agile workflow? I'm not actually exactly sure how does innovation work itself in an agile workflow. I'm not actually sure what to do with that question, Clint, if you want to try to restate it for me.
Yeah, I think my interpretation of that is that is a lot of times backlogs are reactionary to problems that
Okay,
people are facing.
sure.
My guess is he's asking, when you've got a giant backlog that's filled with reactionary, trying to do bug fixes and overcome technical debt, how do you build something? Okay, great, awesome. How do you work in the future features that are going to cause you to stand out in the marketplace and differentiate your product and further innovate? How do you prioritize those things that are going to be a big multiplier on the business, but that might not feel like they have the urgency of the bug fixes and the technical debt?
Yeah, well, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I often feel like the business leaders often see the features and want to prioritize the features over the technical debt and maybe the bugs. And it just depends. I think the bug depends on how bad it is and how many people are complaining. So I like the way that I approach software is bugs are always fixed first. So that is just kind of a fundamental guiding principle to me. We use testing heavily. We have very agile software. And so if there are bugs, we generally can get on those in days. Like my team will even prioritize bug fixes outside of the normal flow of priority, as long as it's not going to displace too bad, or it doesn't require some big real investment in kind of reorganizing the app to fix it. So bug fixes to me are always a top priority. And I think that's good for a culture to have that as true. And what that does is that requires the developers to write better tests, hopefully, and it requires your QA to do a better job of not letting bugs get out the door. In my experience, organizations that do not prioritize bug fixes have a tendency to just shipping bugs becomes acceptable. And at level 12, shipping bugs it's not that it's unacceptable in the sense that like you're going to get fired. It's just that shipping a known bug is not okay. You need to go get the bug fixed. And then if you get a bug report in, you go fix the bug. And then you can keep working on everything else that you do. And doing that means that the backlog shouldn't be very full of bugs, I think, if you operate that way. In terms of technical debt or maintenance or other things that would be good to do but aren't urgent, our bigger clients, we ask them to give us a budget for that. And so we get a monthly budget. And I think this is how I would approach it internally with an organization as well. Is okay, so we've got 4 developers. We get roughly 150 productive developers a month. That gives me 600 hours. And so I would be negotiating, if I was the CTO, I would be negotiating with my business people asking, okay, of the 600 hours a month that are available to development, as an organization, how much time are we devoting to new features and how much time are we devoting to, technical debt and maintenance? And, a scrappy startup that's, still trying to find market share and might not be in business in a year, and that might be like 90% business value, 10%, technical debt and cleanup. A really well-established organization that's got a lot of software with a lot of surface area, they might be something like 70% maintenance and bug fixes and 30% new features. And then for the business user, dropping them in the middle of a 1,000-issue GitHub thing is not going to be helpful. For them, what you're going to want to do is just show that you're keeping to those ratios. So you're going to want to be able to track the work that's been done, and you're going to be able to say, hey, look, we're generally sticking to 30% feature development, 30% bug fixes, and 40% maintenance. And over time, they get a sense of, hey, look, you're committed to them and what you've agreed to as a business. It may be helpful to highlight in your sprint reports some of the key maintenance and bug fixes that are getting done so that the business user can see a sense of value to that without, dropping them into a bunch of detail that's just going to make them roll their eyes.
That's a great answer, Randy. And that brings us to time. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was a really powerful conversation. I really loved getting your thoughts on this. To everyone here, I'm going to be sending the deck and the recording of this. And if you have any additional questions, I'll also include, Randy, I'll sync with you after, whether I include your email or Royce's email or somebody else on your team, but I'll make sure that if anyone has any further questions, they can get a hold of the Level 12 team, because your team has been absolutely amazing to work with, and I think you're really smart folks. We will be having in that deck, I've got some information about Woven, and a quote from Randy about what it's been like to work with us, which you can read about in the deck. We're going to be having another webinar next week with a company in Indianapolis called Powder Keg about how you can use culture as an unfair advantage in tech recruiting. We'll also be sending an invite to that webinar at the end of this as well. So thank you all so much for coming today. This was amazing. Randy, thank you so much. Royce, thanks so much for coordinating. And everyone, have a great rest of the week.
Sounds good, Tim. Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.